My name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for social studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at how do I lay the foundations for an anti-racist classroom. This will be the first of several videos that eventually we'll dive into when it comes to anti-racist curriculum and instruction. We begin with a racial equity policy, something that guides one of the major pillars of what our district represents. You'll notice that under the policy directives, there's an element here about ensuring that the curriculum is in order, that it really does reflect and understand not just dominant narratives, but also looking at students of color and where they exist around the world and the histories that have led us to the point of where we are. So what does anti-racism really require? Here we have two examples of two different groups who are looking at approaching anti-racism. We'll continuously be building out our curriculum around these two measures. The first one is really from Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. He talks about the difference between anti-racist, assimilationists, and segregationists. And that really an anti-racist is one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. This is not saying that racial inequities do not exist. It's saying that there is nothing wrong with people of color. There is nothing wrong, as Kendi says, the only thing that is wrong with black people is that other people say there's something wrong with black people. When it comes to an assimilationist, this is largely what most of our history and background has been based upon. The melting pot idea, where essentially all groups are going to be seen as culturally or behaviorally inferior, and then ultimately everything is guiding them towards the dominant culture. We're going to forego the understanding of assimilationist beliefs, recognizing full well that this denies the experience of individuals around our district and our community. We won't even talk about the segregationists. They don't even need the time of day. When it comes to recommendations for anti-racist curriculum, we're really looking at what's going on with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Here they really lay a better foundation and espousing upon what Kendi is really laying out and how to be an anti-racist. That you discuss the past and present racism, stereotyping, and discrimination in society. That we don't whitewash, that we see color, and that we recognize that race is socially constructed and not biologically true. When it comes to learning about economic, structural, and historical roots of inequality, we can look no further than the redlining that has existed and persisted in Jefferson County. Finding examples of institutional racism in school and confront them. This is something that's really owning up to the idea that this is not something that exists in a far-off place, but is actually grounded in the very schools our students attend. And then we're analyzing then unequal social power relations that exist in our society. Who's dominating and who's being oppressed? That you know the realities of racism and know the human consequences of racism and how demoralizing that it would be. That we don't want to have teachers who walk into classrooms and say, I don't see color. That in trying to recognize that we also try to change what's going on, and by really confronting those which are assimilationist or segregationist policies, championing the ideas then of an anti-racist policy. What is essential for democratic classrooms is the recognition that every student has agency, that every student has a voice, and that every student has questions, and that every student has a mindset for viewing and understanding and shaping those worlds. So how is it that we're going to lend to the students being able to show them different types of mindsets, different ways of approaching their world? How is it that we're going to allow students to explore the questions, specifically the hard ones, right, that teachers may not be ready for? But we cannot forsake the inquiries of our students for the comfort in our own profession. And that by providing a scaffold through inquiry, through a process, we're able to allow students to better develop arguments, backed with evidence from multiple perspectives that address the questions they have in society, so that they can take and own the change that they want to see. Which is why, in every class, we're looking at how these four major elements are working together. That it's through the thinking that enables a process to produce arguments and actions as products. That civic dispositions that support democracy need to be embodied by every student and every citizen. That we're trying to pursue accuracy and understanding, protect the freedoms of self and others, to foster community, to engage in democracy, to ensure equity and justice, and ultimately promote the common good. That's the common good for everybody. And that we live in a pluralistic democracy that is strengthened by its heterogeneous nature. When it comes to different types of dispositions, one of the types of principles that help us move much more towards an anti-racist curriculum is the embodiment of and the use of these 5 principles of Black historical consciousness, which were still actually being generated by Dr. LeGarrette King from the University of Missouri. He has broken down the study of looking at power, oppression, and racism, and how oftentimes, specifically, white curriculums have really been dominated by victimization of Black people and people of color. That we also need to talk about agency, resistance, and perseverance. That Africa and African diaspora and the experiences and commonalities need to be talked about, and how ancient civilizations can connect to today, and understanding how Blackness is more global. Having students focus on Black joy and love as a shared humanity. That's ultimately what we want to understand, to counter the ideas of white supremacy, right, with anti-Blackness. So that you can, and Black love and joy that are really about a shared humanity, that really is trying to counter the idea of white supremacy and anti-Blackness with anti-racism. And finally, as Dr. King would say, looking at the complexities of the movement, where we're looking at oftentimes Black history is dominated by men who are straight, who are Christian, who are middle class. And so we're looking at the different ideas and intersectionalities and the identities that make up the historical analysis of that Black history. How do dispositions live in questions? So these dispositions and understanding how to build an anti-racist curriculum help us try to reshape our questions towards those ends. Here's our second attempt at trying to do that in an elective called Developing Black Historical Consciousness that uses those principles as a way of getting at this, but we're also able to use these same questions across our other curriculum. You can sort of see here that we're trying to counter some of these ideas. And one of my favorite questions is Unit 7, because how often do we see an opportunity for students to explore how did Black Americans create a culture of Black joy and love in the 1920s? This is not often how we frame and look at some of these questions, but we can and we should. We're also using different ideas. For example, here, teaching tolerance as social justice standards provide opportunities for teachers to rethink how their curriculum is operationalized in their classrooms. As an example of how to pull these two together, we see then that in Unit 8, how did Black Americans persevere during times of uncertainty, looking at the Great Depression and World War II, we could be looking at agency, resistance, and perseverance, Black joy and love, and then we could also be considering some of the social justice standards when it comes to identity, diversity, justice, and action. How would these then help change and shape the type of classroom that you would have and the type of expectations that you want your students to uphold? When it comes to best practices that promote anti-racism, we produce a document that's really aimed at trying to eliminate curriculum violence. What are some examples of curriculum violence? Here are just a few. Never in a million years do we want to expose students to these type of activities. That we don't want to have slavery with a smile, or reenact having kids lay down on to reenact slave ships, or to have them participate in a fake Underground Railroad reenactment, or to have them participate and a slave auction or a slave recess game. Or I'm sure we can come up with better math problems than having slavery math problems, or to pretend to be a slave and have to write from that perspective. These are not just demeaning, these are not just insulting to the lived experiences of our students, both past and present. These are examples of curriculum violence. So what are some tools that teachers can use to think about their identity and choices, to address equity? Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Programs Division resource teachers have put together 2 tools to help do this. One is the Racial Equity Analysis Tool, right, the REAP, which is an instrument about making decisions that impact students of color negatively or marginalize them. Another is the R tool, which is an instrument to assist PLCs in using an equity lens in planning. Another piece of this is, and something they can help out with tremendously, is trying to be culture responsive in your teaching pedagogies. Here's a few examples of the R tool, which we will link into the documents below, of what it can be used for in your PLC to be looking at the equity through that lens. Content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice elimination, equitable pedagogy, empowering classroom culture, and ultimately looking at using the R for your assessments. Something else that you might use to foster identity and reflection is some of the tools that we've adapted from teaching tolerance. When looking at evaluating your own comfort levels, or maybe even the comfort levels of students when you're engaging in discussion, looking at your strengths and weaknesses as a teacher, and maybe the strengths and weaknesses of your PLC or department or school, and ultimately developing a plan for the strong emotions that would surely come and arise when looking at different types of questions, sources, and the types of lived experiences that are being brought into the classroom each day. We don't want to deny that. We just want to make sure that we have a response to it so that we can be there for our students when they are at their most vulnerable. When it comes down to breaking down best practices in social studies, we've put together a document here looking specifically at questions, sources, and tasks. So here we have a best practices, things that we want to see, that inquiry can be used in a certain way, and that questions can be very empowering to the classroom and to the student. That really it's about co-creating these and constantly critiquing and assessing the types of questions that we ask, and using those questions to dictate processes in our classes and help guide the arguments and actions that we take. We want to avoid those kind of questions that put students in a position to defend morally or culturally reprehensible positions. So here we're looking at what best practices in the social studies are when it comes to sources. You can sort of see here that we know that sources are going to be problematic. That's why we're addressing this from the very beginning. We know that they're going to be uncomfortable. The question is for you is to figure out how to move students safely in and safely out of those conversations around those sources. How do you modify or adapt? How do you talk to your students about how they're going to deal with those sources? So that we can do a better job of developing historical empathy and a way of approaching sources in a way that is a critical approach as opposed to an emotional one. With that said, there's going to be emotional reactions, which is why we recommend being able to have a plan of responding to them. On the avoidances here, we have to say that oftentimes teachers still, there's a reason why this document exists, still insist on using certain language and racial slurs, perpetuating stereotypes, or overly simplify things in a way that don't allow students to discuss the complexity. Or they use neutral tertiary sources like textbooks that proclaim objectivity, which are just as biased as anything else that we might have. Also, when it comes to tasks, that ultimately we want students to be able to build up the skills necessary to take informed action and to have the skills necessary to create good arguments. When it comes to tasks, we highly recommend that the simulations that you might do in your class are based upon procedural experiences without placing students in positions of trauma and non-culturally responsive positions. So for example, mock courts and governments and legislators and elections, awesome. What would be bad is reenactments. Students don't necessarily have to be sold at a slave auction to understand that slave auctions are not good. We don't want to have students lying on the floor to simulate slave ships, or to dress up like indigenous groups in paper costumes, or write letters pretending to be a different race, gender, or historical character. While on the surface it might seem good as far as taking those perspectives, what we can actually do is look at the lived experiences of those perspectives and the sources we can use inferencing, and we can use historical empathy to try to better understand them. Additionally, any type of activities that are disconnected from argumentation or action don't allow us to really have our students examine the complexity of the social world, do not align to our standards, and are really just an old school bastardization of social studies that overly simplifies or trivializes people of the past and in a contemporary sense. So ultimately then, what we're trying to do, and I hope this hasn't been offensive to anyone, if it has or you have questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. This is an ongoing process where we're trying to figure out what is the best thing for our students. What is the best thing when it comes to our teachers, and how do we approach the classroom? This is not meant to be any kind of warning or understanding. It's more to raise awareness of the types of choices, both the curricular and instructional, that we're making with our students. This has been a video about how do I lay the foundations for an anti-racist classroom. Thank you.